Is it possible for Chris Olave to finish as a wide receiver one this season? Well, he's being drafted as though there's a good chance. And people think that because Clint Kubiak is the new offensive coordinator, that Chris Olave is going to be hyper targeted. Let's look at some data from the past 3 seasons in terms of offenses that he's been a part of and what we've seen from number one wide receivers in said offenses. And let's see if, based on a couple of things that I'll explain later, what we might be able to project for Chris Olave and if his ADP makes any sense. All right, so Chris Olave is 6 foot 185. He's a little bit over 24 years old. He had a 4.39 40-yard dash and a pretty decent speed score because he isn't a tiny receiver. His burst score, which is his vertical and broad jump, is pretty low to be honest with you, and his catch radius is average. Overall, though, he is a very technically sound wide receiver. He runs amazing routes. He has pretty good hands. He's just not the best yards after catch guy. And now, in redraft, he's going off the board as a wide receiver 12, so the lowest low-end wide receiver 1. And in Dynasty, he's going off the board as a wide receiver 11, so one spot ahead, but still a low-end wide receiver 1. Looking at a couple of advanced stats here, as well as some counting stats, his 87 receptions this past season was good for 14th. His 1,123 receiving yards was good for 17th. His yards after catch of 347 was good for 23rd. That's definitely not the strength of his game, but it's not as if he's wide open, he's just going to fall down or something. He's just not the best at that, but he's so good at getting open before the catch that it really doesn't matter. When we look at his yards per out run of 2.08, that was good for 21st. When we look at his formation adjusted yards per out run, his 1.84 was good for 19th. And when we look at his route win rate, his 50.9% was good for 27th. And his 40.8 win rate versus man specifically was good for 29th. So not elite, but pretty good. When we look at his unrealized air yards of 1,058, that was third in the entire NFL. A lot of that is because Derek Carr is just not the best quarterback by NFL standards. When we look at his target quality rating, his 5.50 was good for 27th in the NFL. That could definitely be worse. However, his 71.7 catchable target rate was good for 43rd. So once again, not the best. So overall, his quarterback situation leaves a lot to be desired, but as you can tell, this guy is a very talented wide receiver. All right, so before we get into being a wide receiver 1, to be a wide receiver 2 in general, you need above a 20% targets per route run rate, or target rate. Well, when we look at Chris Olave's rookie season and second season, in his rookie season, he had a 29.3% targets per route run rate. Now, this chart is from this past season through week 16, so it's not perfect, but in general, you can see that that would have been very, very high, probably right around the league leaders. Then it did dip a lot this past season. It went down to 25.6%, which still would have barely missed the mark in terms of weeks through week 16 the next season. So once again, not a perfect match. But as you can see, he definitely is good enough because, once again, targets per out run is an indication that you are talented. In a worst case scenario, it just means that you're that much more talented than the next guy. But in his scenario, it is that he's actually that talented, but he's also that much more talented than the next guy. And what that means is his targets per out run rate suggests that this guy should be a low-end wide receiver 1, at least based on this past season, and assuming his quarterback play wasn't terrible, a relatively high-end wide receiver as a rookie. All right, so over the past 5 seasons, an average wide receiver 1 has 144.6 targets, 97.4 receptions, 1,311 total yards, and 9.5 touchdowns. Well, this past season, Chris Olave had 138 targets, so it didn't quite meet the 144. His 87 receptions did fall short of the 97. His 1,123 receiving yards fell pretty short of the 1,311 average, and his 5 touchdowns fell well short, was essentially half of the 9.5 average. Now, to be fair to him, if he had played a full 17-game slate, because these stats were for 16 games, he would have met the targets threshold. He would not have met the receptions threshold. He also wouldn't have met the receiving yards or touchdowns threshold. But that, to be fair, was under a different offensive coordinator but I just wanted to get a good baseline as to what we've seen so far in his career. All right, so people are treating this offense as though it's going to be the 2021 Vikings offense. In my opinion, at least, in what I've heard about people's perception of what Chris Olave's target share will look like. So, for instance, they're saying that he's going to be receiving a massive, massive, massive target share and a lot of total targets, essentially, is what I'm really getting at. Well, to be fair, the last time Clint Kubiak was an offensive coordinator, you see Justin Jefferson's rookie season, he had 167 targets, over 1,800 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns. So the last time that he was an offensive coordinator, although Justin Jefferson is just a little bit better than Chris Olave, in my opinion, he did have a massive season in terms of his wide receiver one. Then in 2022, Kubiak was the passing game coordinator for the Broncos. I treated Courtland Sutton as the wide receiver one due to him having the most amount of targets. Now, there are factors at play here. Courtland Sutton is nowhere near as talented as Justin Jefferson, and Russell Wilson, at least at that stage of his career, isn't Kirk Cousins from 2021. So a reasonable amount of decline can be expected there. And once again, he was the passing game coordinator, so that isn't quite the same, but so that it's not such a limited sample size, I wanted to get the past 3 years of production in terms of offenses he was a part of. And then this past season, he was the passing game coordinator for the 49ers. I treated Brandon Ayuk as the wide receiver one. And so, as you can see, Brandon Ayuk had 105 targets. Now, once again, it wasn't 17 games, but it was relatively close. And so the point I'm getting at is that, yes, while he wasn't the offensive coordinator, the last 2 years and the last 2 offenses he's been a part of, their wide receiver ones have not had nearly as much of a disparity between their target share and the rest of the receivers. Although, to be fair, for the 49ers, all of their playmakers are elite, essentially. And for the Broncos, their playmakers were relatively similar in total talent. Then I did a little bit of research to see what beat writers, bloggers, analysts were saying about this offense. Well, Kubiak himself says he wants to have a run-first offense. And now, while him saying that doesn't per se mean anything, he did say that. And they do have Kamara as well as Taysom Hill, so there's a decent chance that they are going to run the ball a good amount. However, through training camp, to be fair, it's been reported that Chris Olave has been targeted a ton. And then I also saw online that, and now whether you pay Mike Clay any credence, his 2024 projections for Chris Olave are 138 targets, 86 receptions, 1,246 yards, and 6 touchdowns, which would be a little bit of an uptick in yards, 1 more touchdown than this past season, and 1 less catch. So once again, whether or not you pay any credence to Mike Clay's projections or not, that's up to you. But I just wanted to throw that in there. Getting to the math, I did quite an extensive amount of math to try to figure out a couple of variables that could be at play here, and as well as to average and increase the sample size of what we might be able to expect to be a little bit more reasonable, as opposed to just using the 2021 Vikings or just the low-end projections, for instance. So Justin Jefferson, for instance, had a 27.65 target share the last time Kubiak was the official offensive coordinator for a team. In the next 2 years, though, when he wasn't an offensive coordinator but was a passing game coordinator, his team's wide receiver one had a 19.09 and 21.38% target share. The average passing yards of the 2021 Vikings, 2022 Broncos, and 2023 49ers was 4,345 passing yards. Over the course of the past 3 seasons, his team's wide receiver one averaged 127 targets, 82 receptions, 1,262 yards, and 6 touchdowns. If we use Justin Jefferson's target share to try to project what Chris Olave may do this season, along with the average passing yards and pass attempts for the past 3 seasons for Kubiak's teams, along with the average conversion rate of targets to receptions, total percentage of yards the number one wide receiver had, and as well as the touchdowns on average over the past 3 seasons for the wide receiver 1 target on their team, Olave would finish 2024 with 153 targets, 99 receptions, 1,260 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Finally, we get to the point where we look at the average wide receiver 1 over the past 3 seasons under Kubiak in terms of the average targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns of the number 1 target over the past 3 seasons, as well as looking at all these average stats, including the average pass attempts and total passing yards over the past 3 seasons, but using Justin Jefferson's target share, where Chris Olave would have finished in 2023. Well, using the averages of the past 3 wide receiver 1s in the past 3 offenses that include Kubiak, Chris Olave would have finished as the wide receiver 15 in a full PPR and the wide receiver 15 in a half PPR in 2023. Now, if we use Justin Jefferson's target share, he would have had, once again, 153 targets, 99 receptions, 1,260 yards, and 6 touchdowns, and would have finished as the wide receiver 12 in a full PPR and the wide receiver 15 in a half PPR this past season. When we use the 3-year averages compared to over the past 5 seasons, what an average wide receiver 1 had in terms of targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, using the 3-year averages, he would have had 127 targets. That would have fallen short of the 144 necessary. He would have had 82 receptions. That would have fallen short of the 97 necessary. His 1,262 yards would have fallen a little bit short of the 1,311, but not too far behind. And then his 6 touchdowns would have fallen pretty short of the 9.5. And what that means is if you use the past 3-year averages for the number 1 target in a Kubiak-related offense, they're not generally going to be a wide receiver 1. However, if you use Justin Jefferson's target share, he would have had 153 targets. That would have beaten the 144.6. He would have had 99 receptions. That would have beaten the 97.4. His 1,260 yards still would have fallen short of the 1,311, but not by too much. And his 6 touchdowns would have fallen short of the 9.5. So he has the targets necessary if you use Justin Jefferson's target share. He has the receptions necessary if you use his target share. He falls a little bit short on the receiving yards, and he falls pretty well short on the touchdowns. All in all, I think that based on what we've seen from Kubiak-related offenses over the past 3 seasons, his likely high-end outcome is being a low-end wide receiver 1. And the other thing is, Justin Jefferson's numbers, for instance, are with Kirk Cousins at the helm. See, Chris Olave still has Derek Carr, and a scheme can be as good as it can be. If the quarterback isn't going to be a very good quarterback, it really doesn't matter how good the scheme is. So I think that in an absolutely perfect world, he could finish probably at best as the wide receiver 9 to 10. And that's if he has a very good year with touchdowns. He's not generally been a good touchdown scorer. I mean, he had 5 this past season. And while I don't mean that in the sense of trying to be disparaging to him, I like him as a receiver. I think that he's being drafted in terms of the wide receiver 12 in redraft and the wide receiver 11 in dynasty, relatively close to his maximum ceiling. I think at ADP, for instance, Drake London is going after him. I think Drake London, first of all, he's going to have either Kirk Cousins or Michael Penix, and he's going to be in a Rams offense. I personally like him a lot more than Chris Olave this season. So that's just an example of one wide receiver that can be had later in drafts. And once again, I don't mean this as a disparagement to Chris Olave. I just think people are really reaching here in terms of drafting him just about at his maximum ceiling, which if you really believe in him, and I could definitely be wrong too. I think that people are really drafting him at his ceiling though, and I would strongly advise if he were to fall a couple picks later, drafting him, but I definitely don't like drafting players, at least in my opinion, at what I think their perceived ceiling is in fantasy football. I want to draft players that could definitely outperform their ADP. So those are my thoughts on Chris Olave. I think that his ceiling is at best wide receiver 9 to 10. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 12 in a redraft format and the wide receiver 11 in Dynasty. relatively close to his ceiling in my opinion. Now Dynasty, he could always get a quarterback upgrade, so this is more so meant towards the redraft community. But what do you think? Do you think I'm mistaken? Do you think he has much more upside? Do you agree with me? Do you think he has much less upside than where he's being drafted? Please let me know below in the comment section. And feel free to check out my rankings videos for tight ends, running backs, wide receivers, and quarterbacks. I just released them the past 2 days. And remember to make sure that your lineups are set. You don't want to be starting any injured players or scrubs. So once again, check out the rankings videos. And remember to have an absolutely wonderful weekend because football is back.